The chains were cold against his wrists, and the metal bit into his skin as the guards dragged him through the endless corridors of the prison ship. Commander Marcus Cole had stopped counting the days since they captured him, and he had stopped caring about where they were taking him because he already knew the answer. The Volanti hegemony had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years, and in all that time, they had never encountered a species quite like humanity, and they certainly had never encountered a man quite like Marcus Cole. He was not the strongest human, and he was not the smartest, and he was definitely not the most diplomatic, but he had something that terrified the alien empire more than any weapon or army. He simply refused to break. The Volanti were tall creatures with gray skin and 4 arms and eyes that glowed with a soft blue light, and they moved with the confidence of a species that had conquered 1,000 worlds, and they looked at other races the way a farmer might look at livestock. When humanity first made contact with the galactic community, the Volanti had expected the usual pattern, and new species always followed the same path. Of first came wonder, then came fear, then came submission. But humanity had skipped the submission part entirely. Marcus remembered the first time he stood before the Galactic Senate, and he remembered how the Volanti High Arbiter had explained the rules of the galaxy, and how every species had its place, and how humanity would learn to accept its role as a minor participant in the grand order of things. Marcus had laughed in his face. That was 15 years ago. And since then, he had led 3 rebellions and freed 12 colony worlds and inspired countless other species to question why exactly they were bowing to the Volanti. Now they had finally caught him. The guards stopped before a massive door, and it slid open to reveal a chamber filled with robed figures, and at the center stood the High Arbiter himself, and his 4 arms were folded across his chest, and his glowing eyes were filled with something Marcus had never seen in a Volanti before. Fear, Commander Cole, the High Arbiter said, and his voice echoed through the chamber. You have been found guilty of crimes against the hegemony, and crimes against galactic peace, and crimes against the natural order itself. Marcus smiled despite the chains, and despite the guards, and despite knowing exactly what was coming. Which crime specifically? He asked. Because I have committed so many that I have lost track. The High Arbiter's eyes flickered with anger, but also with something else, and Marcus realized with grim satisfaction that even now they were afraid of him. Your sentence has been decided, the Arbiter continued, and it is not execution, because execution would make you a martyr, and we will not give humanity that gift. Then what? Marcus asked. The robed figures in the chamber began to chant, and their voices rose and fell in an ancient rhythm, and Marcus felt something cold crawl down his spine because he recognized the words. Every species in the galaxy knew about the Void God. It was not a myth, and it was not a legend, and it was not a story told to frighten children, because it was real, and it was ancient, and it was hungry. The Void God existed in the space between galaxies where no light could reach, and where no ship could travel, and where reality itself began to fray at the edges, and it had been there since before the first stars were born, and it would be there long after the last stars died. Every century the Volanti sent a sacrifice to keep it sleeping, and every century some poor soul was chained to the altar of silence and left to be consumed by something older than time itself. You cannot be serious, Marcus said, but he kept his voice steady because he would not give them the satisfaction of seeing his fear. The Void God will consume you, the High Arbiter said, and there was genuine pleasure in his voice now. And your defiance will mean nothing, and your rebellion will fade from memory, and humanity will learn that some forces cannot be resisted. They dragged Marcus to another ship, and this one was smaller and darker, and it had no windows because there was nothing to see where they were going. The journey took 3 weeks, and Marcus spent every moment in darkness and silence, and he had nothing but his thoughts to keep him company. He thought about Earth and how beautiful it had been before the Volanti came, and he thought about the billions who had died when the hegemony decided that humanity needed to be taught a lesson. He thought about his sister, and how she had smiled at him the last time he saw her, and how that smile had disappeared, along with half the planet. When the orbital bombardment began, he thought about every friend he had lost, and every soldier who had followed him into impossible battles, and every person who had believed in him when believing seemed foolish, and he thought about the Void God. The ship finally stopped, and the guards came for him, and they were shaking as they led him through the airlock and onto the Altar of Silence. It was a station made of black metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the architecture was wrong in ways that hurt to look at because the angles did not make sense and the corridors seemed to shift when Marcus was not looking directly at them. The Volanthi priests moved quickly, and their hands trembled as they chained Marcus to a platform at the very heart of the station, and below the platform was nothing but darkness, and the darkness seemed to breathe. "May your suffering be brief," one of the priests whispered, and Marcus almost laughed because it was the kindest thing any Volanthi had ever said to him. Then they left, and Marcus was alone. The station was silent in a way that went beyond mere absence of sound, and it was the silence of the void itself, and it pressed against Marcus from all sides like a physical weight. He waited. Hours passed, or maybe days, because time seemed to move strangely here, and Marcus found himself drifting between sleep and waking, and he could not tell where one ended and the other began. Then the darkness below him moved. It was not a movement he could see exactly, but he felt it in his bones and in his blood and in the deepest parts of his mind, and something vast and ancient and hungry had finally noticed him. The Void God was awake, and it was looking at him. Marcus felt the pressure of its attention, and it was like standing at the bottom of an ocean made of shadows, and he felt his mind beginning to crack under the weight of something that should not exist. But Marcus Cole had faced impossible odds before, and he had stared down armies and empires, and he had watched his world burn and still found the strength to stand up the next morning. So he did something that no sacrifice had ever done in the entire history of the Volanthi ritual. He looked back into the darkness, and he smiled. And he said 5 words that would change the fate of the galaxy forever. "Is that all you have?" The Void God had existed since before the universe had a name, and it had watched galaxies spin into existence and collapse into nothing. And it had consumed beings of pure energy and devoured civilizations that thought themselves immortal in all that time. It had never encountered anything like the creature that now hung in chains above its domain. The entity did not think in words, because words were too small and too slow for something that existed outside of time itself. But if it had to describe what it felt in that moment, the closest word would have been confusion. Every sacrifice the Volanthi had sent over the millennia had followed the same pattern, and first came the screaming, and then came the begging, and then came the breaking, and finally came the silence as the entity consumed what remained. But this one was different. This one had looked into the infinite darkness and smiled and asked if that was all the Void God had to offer. The Duthavon had looked into the infinite darkness and smiled and asked if that was all the Void God had to offer. The fawn the Void God had to offer. Entity pressed against the mind of the sacrifice, and it expected to find the familiar taste of terror, because fear was the one constant in all living things, and everything that lived was afraid of ending. Instead, it found something else entirely. There was exhaustion in this mind, and there was grief that ran deeper than any ocean, and there was pain that had been carried for so long that it had become part of the foundation, and there was anger that burned like a star that refused to die. But there was no fear. The Void God pushed deeper, because surely the fear was hidden somewhere, and surely this creature was simply better at masking it than most, and surely no living thing could face oblivion without trembling. It sifted through the memories of Marcus Cole, and it saw things that made no sense to an entity that had witnessed the birth of reality itself. It saw a species that had evolved on a small blue world circling an unremarkable star, and it saw how they had crawled from the mud and learned to make fire, and learned to make tools, and learned to make weapons, and learned to split the very atoms that held the universe together. It saw wars that should have ended them, and plagues that should have wiped them out, and disasters that should have broken their spirits forever. And yet they kept going, and they kept building, and they kept reaching for the stars. It saw Marcus as a child, watching his father work on machines that could travel between worlds, and it saw the wonder in his eyes as he looked up at the night sky and dreamed of what might be waiting out there. It saw Marcus as a young man standing on the bridge of his first command, watching Earth grow smaller in the viewport and feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a cloak. It saw Marcus watching his homeworld burn as Volanti warships rained fire from orbit, and it saw him fall to his knees and scream at a sky that did not care, and it saw something break inside him that would never fully heal, and then it saw him stand up. That was the part that confused the void God the most, because the entity had seen countless beings lose everything, and when beings lost everything, they stopped and they surrendered, and they accepted that the universe was too vast and too cruel and too indifferent to fight against. But Marcus Cole had lost everything, and instead of surrendering, he had become something more dangerous than he had ever been before. The void god pulled back from the memories, and it regarded the man with something that might have been curiosity. If the entity had been capable of such a small emotion, "You were looking for something," Marcus said aloud, and his voice was steady despite the impossible pressure that was crushing against his mind. "So why do you not just ask?" The entity considered this, and it realized that no sacrifice had ever spoken to it before, because all of them had been too busy screaming, "What are you?" The question did not come in words, but in pure meaning that carved itself directly into Marcus's consciousness, and he understood it the way he understood hunger or pain or love. "I am tired," Marcus replied, "and I'm angry, and I'm absolutely done being someone else's symbol, and I am a human being, which probably does not mean anything to something like you." The void god searched its vast memory, and it found the word human buried somewhere in the accumulated knowledge of 1,000,000 consumed minds, and the information was sparse because humanity was young and the galaxy had not yet learned to pay attention to them. Humans, and the concept came with images of small, soft creatures with short lifespans and fragile bodies and no natural weapons to speak of. "That is us," Marcus said. "We are small and soft, and we die easily, and we have been told our entire existence that we are nothing special, and we have never once believed it." The entity examined him more closely, and it began to understand why the Volanti had sent this particular human as a sacrifice, because there was something in him that could not be conquered, and could not be contained, and could not be allowed to spread. "Why do you not fear me?" "Because I have already lost everything that matters," Marcus said, "and because fear is a luxury I cannot afford, and because honestly, you are not the scariest thing I have faced this week." The void god was ancient beyond measure, and it had been worshipped and feared and obeyed by civilizations that had risen and fallen while humanity was still learning to walk upright, and in all that time it had never been insulted by a sacrifice. It should have been angry, and it should have consumed this impudent creature immediately, and it should have made his end slow and painful as punishment for his disrespect. Instead, it felt something it had not felt in eons: interest. "Your kind refuses to accept their place in the universe." "We do not have a place in the universe," Marcus said. "We make our own place, and if the universe does not like it, then the universe can take it up with us directly." The void god considered this for a long moment, and somewhere in its vast consciousness, a decision was being made that would reshape the fate of galaxies. It had slept for so long because there was nothing worth staying awake for, and it had consumed sacrifices because that was what was expected of it, and it had played the role the lesser beings had assigned to because it had never occurred to the entity that it could do something else. But this human had looked upon infinity and found it wanting. And that was the most interesting thing the Void God had encountered since the first stars began to burn. The chains that held Marcus crumbled to dust, and the platform beneath him began to rise, and the darkness that had been pressing against him from all sides pulled back like a tide retreating from shore. What would you do if you had the power to unmake your enemies? Marcus rubbed his wrists where the chains had been, and he looked into the darkness that surrounded him, and he gave the question the consideration it deserved. I would not unmake them, he said finally, because destruction is easy and any fool with enough power can break things. But building something that lasts is the real challenge. The Void God was silent, and Marcus could feel the weight of its attention pressing against him, but it was different now, and it was not trying to crush him, but rather it was waiting. I would build something better, Marcus continued. Something they cannot control or corrupt or claim, and I would give every species in the galaxy a choice that the Volanti never offered them. What choice? The choice to be free, Marcus said. The choice to decide their own future and the choice to stand up and say no when someone tells them to kneel. The darkness around him shifted and changed, and Marcus felt something impossible happening because the Void God was not reaching out to consume him. It was kneeling. I have devoured gods, and I have consumed the architects of reality, and I've ended civilizations that thought themselves eternal and in all. That time I have never met a soul that burns the way yours does. Is that a compliment? Marcus asked. It is a recognition, and the entity's presence wrapped around him not to destroy, but to protect and to serve. Show me what humanity does with the impossible. And the words carried with them a weight that Marcus felt settle onto his shoulders like the mantle of something far greater than himself. Command me, Marcus Cole, and I will follow. Marcus looked into the infinite darkness, and for the first time since the Volanti had taken everything from him, he felt something that might have been hope. Then we have work to do, he said. Marcus Cole stood in the heart of the altar of silence, and for the first time he truly looked at what surrounded him. The station was ancient beyond anything humanity had ever built, and the black metal walls were covered in symbols that seemed to shift when he was not looking directly at them, and the corridors stretched away in directions that should have been impossible. But now the darkness that filled every corner was not threatening, and it was not hungry, and it was simply waiting. The Void God's presence remained wrapped around Marcus like a cloak made of shadows, and he could feel its attention focused on him with an intensity that would have driven most beings mad. Show me, Marcus said. Show me what the Volanti have done. The darkness responded, and suddenly, Marcus was no longer standing in the station, but floating above the galaxy itself, and he could see it all spread out below him like a map made of stars. Void God showed him the Volanti hegemony in all its terrible glory, and he saw the 12,000 worlds they controlled, and the 100 species they had conquered, and the countless billions who lived under their rule. He saw the truth behind the empire, and how the Volanti had not built their civilization through wisdom or cooperation, but through fear and manipulation and the systematic destruction of anyone who dared to challenge them. He saw species that had once been proud and powerful reduced to servants and workers and resources to be exploited, and he saw how the Volanti had erased their histories and destroyed their cultures and made them believe that they had always been lesser beings. He saw the resistance movements that flickered in the darkness of hegemony space, and he saw how they were hunted and crushed before they could grow into anything dangerous, and he saw the hope dying in the eyes of beings who had been told their entire lives that fighting back was impossible. And he saw humanity. The Void God showed him his own species scattered across the galaxy like seeds blown by a terrible wind, and he saw the refugee fleets hiding in the darkness between stars, and he saw the resistance cells operating in the shadows of Volanti worlds, and he saw the ember of defiance that refused to die no matter how hard the hegemony tried to stamp it out. "They are still fighting." Marcus whispered, "They are waiting." The Void God replied, and the meaning of the words was clear because they were waiting for him. And they were waiting for someone to show them that victory was possible. "How long has it been?" Marcus asked. "Since they captured me. 3 months by the measure your species USES. 3 months, and the resistance was still holding, and his people were still fighting, and the spark he had spent 15 years nurturing had not been extinguished. The Volanthi think I am dead." Marcus said, "They believe you have been consumed, and they have already begun to use your death as a warning to others." Marcus smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Then let us give them a different kind of warning." The vision faded, and Marcus found himself back in the altar of silence, and the Void God's presence shifted around him with what might have been anticipation. "I can unmake them," and the offer came with images of Volanthi worlds crumbling into dust and fleets dissolving into nothing, and an entire empire erased from existence between one heartbeat and the next. "No," Marcus said, "that is not how we do this." The Void God paused, and Marcus could feel its confusion because the entity had expected vengeance and destruction, and the simple, brutal satisfaction of watching enemies cease to exist. Why not? Because if we destroy them, we become exactly what they are. Marcus explained, and because there are innocent people on those worlds who did not choose to be part of the hegemony, and because I want to build something better, not just tear down something worse. I do not understand, Marcus thought about how to explain something that seemed so obvious to him, and he realized that the Void God had existed for so long in isolation that it had never learned certain truths that humans took for granted. "When I was young," Marcus said, "my father told me that anyone can destroy, but only the brave can build. And he said that true strength is not measured by what you can break, but by what you can create." The entity considered this, and Marcus could feel it turning the idea over in its vast consciousness. Your father was WISE. He was a mechanic from a small town who never went to university, and who spent his whole life fixing things that other people had broken. Marcus said, "And he was the wisest person I have ever known." The Void God was silent for a long moment, and when it spoke again, there was something different in its presence, and something that might have been respect. "What do you propose?" "We go back," Marcus said, "and we show the galaxy that the Volanthi are not all-powerful, and we give every species that has been living under their boot a reason to hope, and we build something that can outlast any empire." "How?" "First we find my people," Marcus said, "and then we find every other species that wants to be free, and then we create something the Volanthi have never seen before, which is a coalition built on choice instead of fear," Marcus said. "An alliance where every species is equal and where no one is conquered or controlled, and where the only thing that matters is what you are willing to give, not what can be taken from you." The Void God's presence seemed to expand, and Marcus could feel it considering the scope of what he was suggesting. "This will take time." "We have time," Marcus said. "Or at least you do, and you can lend me some of yours." "What do you mean?" "I am human," Marcus said, "and humans do not live very long compared to most species. And if this is going to work, then I need to be around long enough to see it through." The darkness around him shifted, and Marcus felt something change deep inside his body. And it was not painful exactly, but it was strange, and he could feel his cells being rewritten and his lifespan being extended in ways that should have been impossible done, and the word carried with it the weight of a gift that most beings would have killed for. "Thank you," Marcus said, and he meant it. "Do not thank me yet." And there was something almost like humor in the entity's presence, because this is only the beginning. The altar of silence still had ships docked in its hangar, and the Volanthi had left them behind, because no one was supposed to leave this place alive. Marcus walked through the corridors of the station, and the Shadows moved with him, and he found a small transport that would be perfect for what he had in mind. "One more thing," Marcus said as he powered up the ship's systems. "I need you to be subtle, and the galaxy cannot know what you really are. And if they find out that the Void God is working with a human, then every species in existence will turn against us." "I can be subtle, can you?" Marcus asked. "Because you are an ancient cosmic entity that exists outside of space and time, and subtle is not exactly your natural state." "I will learn," and the Void God's presence pulled back until it was just a whisper at the edge of Marcus's consciousness, and if he had not known it was there, he might not have noticed it at all. "Better," Marcus said. The transport lifted off from the altar of silence, and Marcus set a course for the edge of hegemony space. He had been gone for 3 months, and in that time, the Volanti had probably convinced themselves that their problems were over. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. As the ship jumped into hyperspace, Marcus felt the void God's presence settle around him like an old friend, and he realized that for the first time since Earth burned, he did not feel alone. "We are going to change everything," he said to the darkness I know, and the response carried with it something that sounded almost like excitement, because that is what makes this interesting. Marcus smiled and watched the stars blur around him and allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in 15 years. Hope. The Galactic Senate had gathered for what they believed would be a routine session, and the representatives of 100 species sat in their designated seats, and the Volanti High Arbiter presided over the chamber from his elevated platform. It had been 4 months since the execution of Marcus Cole, and the hegemony had spent every day since then reminding the galaxy of what happened to those who defied the natural order. Statues had been torn down, and history had been rewritten, and the name Marcus Cole had become a warning whispered by parents to children who dreamed too loudly. The session was interrupted by alarms. Every security system in the Senate complex activated simultaneously, and every door sealed shut, and every weapon was powered up and aimed at a single point in the center of the chamber. The main doors exploded inward, and through the smoke and debris walked a figure that every being in the room recognized. Marcus Cole was supposed to be dead. Marcus Cole was supposed to have been consumed by an ancient god at the edge of the universe. Marcus Cole was standing in the center of the Galactic Senate with a smile on his face, and shadows that moved behind him in ways that shadows should not move. The High Arbiter rose from his seat, and his forearms were trembling, and his glowing eyes were wide with something that looked very much like terror. "This is impossible," the Arbiter said. "You were sacrificed, and you were consumed, and the Void God. The Void God and I had a very interesting conversation," Marcus said, and his voice carried across the silent chamber without effort. "And we came to an understanding." The shadows behind Marcus shifted, and every being in the room felt something press against their minds, and it was vast and ancient, and it was watching them the way a predator watches prey. "You sent me to die," Marcus continued, "and you fed me to something you did not understand because you assumed it would solve your problems, and you never once considered that there might be another outcome." The Volanti guards raised their weapons, and Marcus did not even look at them. "That would be a mistake," he said. The shadows moved, and suddenly the guards were no longer holding weapons because the weapons had simply ceased to exist, and the guards themselves were frozen in place, unable to move or speak or even breathe. "I did not come here to fight," Marcus said, "and I did not come here to destroy, and I came here to deliver a message." The High Arbiter found his voice, and it came out as barely a whisper. "What message?" "The age of the Volanti hegemony is over," Marcus said. "Not because I am going to tear it down, but because I am going to make it irrelevant." He walked forward, and the representatives of 100 species watched him in terrified silence, and the shadows followed him like loyal hounds. "For 10,000 years you have ruled this galaxy through fear," Marcus said, "and you have convinced every species that there is no alternative and that submission is the only path to survival, and that the strong will always dominate the weak. He stopped in front of the High Arbiter's platform and looked up at the alien who had once sentenced him to a fate worse than death. But here is what you never understood about humanity. Marcus continued. We do not accept the rules just because someone tells us they exist, and we do not bow. Just because someone claims to be powerful, and we do not stop fighting. Just because victory seems impossible. The Arbiter's voice was steadier. Now, as he forced himself to respond, you are one human with a parlor trick, he said, and you cannot stand against the combined might of the hegemony. You are right, Marcus said. I am one human, and alone I could not do much against your empire. The shadows behind him grew darker, and the temperature in the chamber dropped, and every being present felt something ancient and terrible focus its attention on them. But I am not alone, Marcus said, and I have made a friend, and my friend is very old, and very powerful, and very interested in seeing what happens next. He turned to address the entire Senate, and his voice rang out like a bell. Humanity is offering alliance to any species that wants one, he said. Real alliance with no masters and no slaves and no hierarchy of worth. And we are building something new, and anyone who wants to join us is welcome. You cannot do this, the High Arbiter said. The order of the galaxy is changing. Marcus interrupted. And you can either change with it, or you can be left behind. And that is the choice I am offering you today. He looked around at the representatives, and many of them were staring at him with something other than fear, and it took him a moment to recognize what it was: hope. I know many of you have been told your entire lives that you are lesser, Marcus said, and I know you have been taught that your place is beneath the Volanti, and I know you have been punished every time you dared to dream of something different. His voice softened but lost none of its intensity. But I have seen the galaxy as it truly is, he said, and I have seen the courage that exists in species that have been beaten down for generations, and I have seen the fire that still burns in beings who have been told that fire is forbidden. He raised his hand, and the shadows around him formed into something that looked almost like wings. That fire is not weakness, Marcus said, and that defiance is not a flaw. And that dream of freedom is not foolish, because it is the most powerful force in the universe. The High Arbiter slammed his hands against his console. Security, he shouted. Arrest this creature. And execute him now. Nothing happened. The guards were still frozen, and the security systems had stopped responding, and every Volanti in the chamber realized with growing horror that they were completely powerless. I'm not going to hurt anyone today, Marcus said, because that is not why I came, and violence is the last resort of those who have run out of ideas, and I have plenty of ideas. He turned back to the High Arbiter. You can try to stop what is coming, Marcus said, and you can send your fleets and your armies and your assassins, but it will not matter because you cannot kill an idea, and the idea that every being in this galaxy deserves to be free is already spreading. The shadows around him began to fade, and the pressure in the chamber eased, and the frozen guards collapsed to their knees, gasping for breath. 1 year, Marcus said, and in 1 year I will return to this chamber, and we will see how many species have chosen to join us, and we will see how many are still willing to kneel to the Volanti. He walked toward the ruined doors and paused at the threshold. And tell your void god to choose its friends more carefully, the High Arbiter called after him, with one last desperate attempt at defiance. Marcus smiled over his shoulder. I will pass along the message, he said, but between you and me I think it already chose very carefully. He walked out of the chamber, and the shadows followed him, and behind him 100 species sat in stunned silence as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. The Volanti High Arbiter remained on his platform, and his 4 hands were shaking, and he understood with terrible clarity that everything was about to change. He had sent Marcus Cole to die, thinking it would end the threat humanity posed to the hegemony. Instead, he had created something far worse than any rebel commander. He had created hope. 5 years had passed since Marcus Cole walked into the Galactic Senate and told the Volanthi hegemony that their time was ending. He had been right. Marcus stood on the observation deck of New Dawn Station and watched as ships from dozens of worlds docked in the massive structure that humanity had built at the edge of what used to be hegemony space. The station was enormous, and it had taken 3 years to construct, and it represented something that had never existed before in the history of the galaxy, a place where every species was equaled. Human coalition had started, small with just a handful of refugee fleets and resistance cells that had survived the Volanthi purges, but it had grown faster than anyone had expected. First came the Karathi, and they were a species of engineers who had been forced to build weapons for the hegemony for generations, and they brought with them knowledge of Volanthi technology and a burning desire to use that knowledge against their former masters. Then came the Silendi, and they were a species of telepaths who had been hunted nearly to extinction because the Volanthi feared their abilities, and they brought with them the capacity to coordinate across vast distances without the hegemony intercepting their communications. Then came the Vorn and the Tethany and the Crystalline Collective and the Children of the Deep Star, and species after species that had been told they were nothing and had finally found the courage to believe otherwise. The Volanthi had tried to stop it. They had sent fleets, and the fleets had been turned back by forces they could not understand. They had sent assassins, and the assassins had disappeared into shadows that moved on their own. They had tried to blockade the coalition worlds, and the blockades had simply ceased to exist. Between one moment and the next, they had never managed to prove that the Void God was involved, because Marcus had kept that secret carefully guarded, and most of the galaxy believed that humanity had simply discovered some ancient technology or developed some new form of power. Only Marcus knew the truth, and only Marcus could feel the ancient presence that followed him everywhere he went. The door behind him opened, and a young woman walked onto the observation deck, and she wore the uniform of a coalition officer, and she had the same stubborn set to her jaw that Marcus saw in the mirror every morning. "Admiral Cole," she said, "the representatives from the Volanthi delegation have arrived." Marcus smiled at the formal address. "You can call me Marcus," he said. "You are my niece after all." Elena Cole had been 7 years old when Earth burned, and she had spent the next 15 years growing up on refugee ships and learning to fight and learning to hate and learning that sometimes the universe took everything from you and expected you to keep going anyway. She was 22 now, and she was one of the best officers in the coalition, and she reminded Marcus so much of his sister that it hurt sometimes. "The representatives are nervous," Elena said, "and I think they expected more security." "They are safe here," Marcus said, "and no one in the coalition will harm them, even though many would like to. They kill billions of our people," Elena said, and there was old pain in her voice. "Yes, they did," Marcus agreed, "and we could spend the rest of our existence trying to make them pay for that, and it would not bring back a single person. We lost, and it would turn us into exactly what we are trying to replace." Elena was quiet for a moment. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you look at them and not want revenge?" Marcus thought about the question, and he thought about his sister who had died on Earth, and he thought about his father who had taught him that building was harder than destroying, and he thought about all the years he had spent fighting and all the people he had lost along the way. "I think about what we are building," he said finally, "and I think about the children on this station who will grow up in a galaxy where no one tells them they are lesser, and I think about how that future is worth more than any revenge could ever be." Elena nodded slowly, and Marcus could see that she did not entirely understand, but that she was trying. "The delegation is waiting," she said. "Then let us not keep them waiting any longer." The meeting chamber was large and round, and it had seats arranged in a circle. so that no one was elevated above anyone else, and this was deliberate because the coalition did not believe. In hierarchies, the Volante delegation consisted of 3 individuals, and they were younger than Marcus had expected, and they looked at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity that he found encouraging. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said as he took his seat. "I know this was not an easy decision." The lead delegate was female, and her 4 arms were folded across her chest in what Marcus had learned was a defensive posture. "The hegemony is dying," she said, "and our people are suffering, and we have come to discuss terms." "We do not offer terms," Marcus said, "and we offer partnership." The delegate's eyes flickered with confusion. "You have defeated us," she said, "and your forces control half of what was once our territory, and you have every right to demand whatever you want." "That is true," Marcus agreed. "And if we demanded tribute and submission, and the dismantling of your civilization, we could probably enforce it." He leaned forward. "But that is not what the coalition is," he said, "and that is not what humanity wants, and that is not the future we are building." The delegate stared at him. "Then, what do you want?"